Welcome to another session of Learner's Mindset Discussion. I'm Dr. Dwayne Hrapnik, and my colleague is
Dr. Talissa Thibodeau.
Today we are going to be talking about a topic that we often talk about in a variety of contexts, and I'm going to summarize it with a statement or a question. And the question is, are you preparing them for life or for the test? And the reason that this has come up is that in the past couple of weeks, in a couple of the courses that I'm facilitating in the Digital Learning and Leading program here at Lamar, the issue of preparing students for standardized testing, we want to do all these amazing, wonderful, authentic things, but we still have to prepare our students for the tests. That issue continues to come up. There are a couple of scenarios, real life circumstances that happened with my boys. Remember, I'm always experimenting on my boys. And so there are a couple of life situations that came up where it was a good thing that I prepared them for life as opposed to the test, because they were able to adapt and overcome and make some adjustments. And so we need to go down this path about talking about the difference between preparing people for the test and preparing people for life. And I want to start out with this argument, this presupposition that we're operating from in the Digital Learning Leading program and with the COVA perspective and the CSLE plus COVA. And that is, if you give learners authentic learning opportunities and give them choice, ownership, and voice through those authentic learning opportunities, and if you've created that significant learning environment where they have that choice, ownership, and voice, well, then you're preparing them for life. Now, as an added bonus, you're also preparing them for the test. Now, if you only prepare them for the test, are you preparing them for life? What do you think?
I think you bring up a good point, because so many times our students are, in the digital learning leading program are always, thinking about what I have to do for test prep. But, I try to encourage them to think about ways where students can apply their learning. So if they're using what they've learned in the classes, or bringing even outside experiences in that can sort of develop a significant learning environment that encompasses that choice, ownership, and voice. But the key piece of that is that authentic learning experiences. So whatever they're learning about, if they can then take those ideas and apply that to their life in some way, they're actually working on those test prep skills along the way. They're actually doing more when they're working toward those authentic learning opportunities. I think about your boys and their racing and all the stories that we've talked about, how many life lessons they've learned just by either tweaking a small mindset whenever they're racing with the Enduro World Series, just tweaking their mindset, or just simply working on the bike. And you can talk more about this, but that authentic learning experience that they have when they go down that path really takes into account all the other things they need to know, math skills, science, all of the above. So that's a really good example. So when you said that, I immediately thought authentic learning experiences, and that's what our kids need a bit more of.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the experiences that we talk about, or I share with you about my boys. Most recently, my older son, who races downhill as a pro rider, and he also races in something called the Enduro World Series. It's enduro racing. It's downhill, but you also pedal up. It's quite a challenging thing, and he races at the world level. There's a major race happening in Whistler, the Crankworks 2018, this upcoming weekend, and so he's been working for months to prepare for this. For months, he was in South America racing, and he had some wonderful exposure to the Enduro World Series there, and he realized what he needed to do. And when he came back at the end of April, beginning of May, since May until now, he's been training and preparing. And the last month and a bit, we've adjusted his mental training. We adopted a new approach. We've been taking a look at the notion of focus and recognizing that you have to actually, in order to prepare your focus, you have to actually train yourself to shift your focus. We don't multitask. We don't do that. And we focus based on a variety of ways that we focus internally. We sometimes come into ourselves, and we focus narrowly, and we focus broadly. And then we also focus externally, narrowly and broadly. And through this methodology, we're looking at training how to focus externally, narrowly, and broadly, and how to focus internally, narrowly, and broadly. And the reason you do that is that when you're in a race, you often have to shift your focus. And so unless you actually train how to shift your focus, you don't do that. Physically, Levi is he's a world-class athlete. Mentally, he's been running into challenges, and he's been, he's got crashes, he makes mistakes, mental errors. There've been a couple of races where he didn't go far enough and he started to relax at the end. Variety of little things. That's all mental errors. Well, this last month and a half that we've been working on this, he had a race last week, a local race, but it's still pretty intense because here in North Vancouver, you're racing against some of the best people in the world. You are. That's what most people train here for, the enduro. And so on this local race, he was in the top 5, and he's slowly been progressing locally as well. And he had a recent race the week before the Canadian Nationals downhill. He didn't do as well as he wanted, but he had a good race, and he was, he finished close to where he wanted to be. So he's in the top half of the athletes in Canada, the top 20 range. So he's doing okay. But one of the things that we have observed is that change, focusing on the focus training. Also, he's been looking at some calming, focus, meditation training, a variety of other things. He's been doing all these things as well as building checklists, all these things, and the results are starting to come. And so in our conversation, we talked about the fact that, what's changed? What's changed? Well, the mental training. So he's recognizing that he's just on the verge of doing really, really well. So now this big major race coming up, he's prepared. The race course was released last night. He was training there last night, and he realized he had trained on 4 of the 5 stages. Physically, he's prepared. Mentally, he's prepared. He's actually feeling pretty good about this. But the work, the ongoing repetitive work, analysis, he keeps a log of what he's doing, writing things down, analyzing, introspection, metacognition, reflection, agonizing over the horrible results, and then looking at ways to improve. That ongoing process doesn't come by practicing for a test. Okay? In his entire life as a student, the working on real world activities, real world projects that he grew up with enabled him to be able to face this ongoing, intense, extended duration challenge. Preparing for a test doesn't do that. So that's one recent example that I think really has reminded me of that. There's also some examples from our students. Any other thoughts about what I've talked about with Levi? Do you want to jump in there?
What I'm hearing you say, I've heard 4 main themes running through what you were talking about. I heard focusing on the need first, and that was an authentic learning experience. His purpose and his why. All of those pieces all apply to the bigger picture concept of what he's doing and why he's doing it, what his purpose is behind it, and how he needs to shift his focus to make that dream come true, kind of thing. And I think sometimes we forget about those things. We get caught in the whirlwind as even as instructors or students. We sometimes lose that sense of our purpose and our passion and our why. And how does, when we're working with students, what are they doing? Who do they want to become? Who do we want to help them to become? And how do they get to that bigger, broader picture perspective? When you talk about Levi getting all the way up to the Enduro World Series at Whistler doing the Cranks work, I think it's called Cranks Works. So that's the bigger, broader picture for him. So all of these shifts and focus and all the smaller things you're talking about, the agonizing to get through, yes, that's part of growing those metacognitive skills, reflecting, which encourages him to actually experience deeper learning, deeper ownership in what he's doing, and make those changes he needs to make. So if we were to take that example and pull it down into the classroom, and really look at it from an authentic context in the classroom, we shouldn't just be teaching math. What is the bigger, broader picture context? What is that authentic learning experience? Why? So when I'm helping folks build their outlines in one of the course that I'm working with in the rough drafts, and always looking at, they might explain and give a really good description about what they're doing, but how does that fit into the bigger, broader picture? That's the big piece. So when you find ways to connect to the bigger, broader picture, the test kind of takes care of itself. Yeah, there may be some drill and practice you have to do 20% of the time, right? 20% of the time, spend 80% of the time on that authentic learning. But that's still there. There are some things that are still there, but that preparing them for life, you don't get that time back. if you're a third grade teacher, a 10th grade teacher, you don't get that time back with those students. You get that one shot, that one opportunity. Are you going to be the teacher that they come back to and say, you know, this person really cared about me, my life, and where I was going. You know, this teacher cared. And just setting up an environment for that to happen, it's critical. It's not easy. Just like what Levi's going through to get to the point where he's at the indoor, it's not easy to do that. You have to kind of shift your focus a little bit to make that happen. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. You've commented on things that I thought about this morning when I stumbled across an article in my reading of some news. Here in Canada, the medical schools are shifting their entrance requirements, and I'll have to dig up, maybe I'll include this link to the article in the post. But I was aware of this over the last couple of years because I've got some friends who have some children who are going into medical school. I've got a nephew-in-law who's in medical school or got into medical school. And the trend, believe this, musical students who do an undergraduate degree in music are desirable doctors. What? Music? What, are they going to sing to their patients, play music? Well, maybe, but that's the first thing you think of, right? Musical students. Well, when you read the article, I already knew this, but when I read the article, I was glad that the reporter picked this up. One of the biggest things that musical students have is the ability for continual, repetitive, ongoing practice over an extended duration of time, okay? That continual improvement. It isn't just doing the act over and over and over and over again. So if we think about our friend Anders Ericsson in deliberate practice, right? So musicians are engaged in deliberate practice, especially musicians who want to improve, right? So if we think of deliberate practice from Anders Ericsson, the key thing with deliberate practice, which is different from traditional practice, is that you add a factor of self-reflection. So with deliberate practice, you don't just mindlessly practice over and over. No, you practice something, you break it down, you take a look at what's happening, and you use feedback to see if it's working, right? And you're always looking to improve. Well, guess what? I'm going to use Levi as an example. And my other son Caleb does this. In the off season, or even now, they also use something called the free lap. They've got these timers. So they've got watches, they've got Garmin devices, they have a timer, and they'll set up a timer and they'll run a section of the course over and over and over again. And they find just that key point, the last second that they can break. They find the point of the berm that will give them the right G-force to come around. They practice over and over and over in that one little section to make sure that's working. So deliberate practice is using a combination of feedback and that feedback to make adjustments in what you're doing. So getting back to the example of the medical students. So medical students who have got a musical background, especially if they're good students when it comes to music, they have this discipline of reflection. They have this discipline of continual improvement. They have this discipline of recognizing that they need to work at it continuously if they need to improve. And so as the reporter sort of quoted a doctor who now is who was a musician, you know, he said, you know, I'm a surgeon and I can run this procedure 35 times in a row. But if I don't focus on continually improving what I'm doing, I'm not getting better, right? When you read that, you go, holy crow, that's totally different than preparing for a test. Because what do you do for a test? You cram, you memorize, you hold your breath, you write the test, you exhale, and it's done. And then you go on to something else. Whereas with real world activities, authentic learning, you're trying something. Oh, that didn't work. I need to adjust. I have to modify. Okay, I'll try that. Oh, that didn't work. I need to adjust, right? So again, I think of those circumstances. Right now, our DLL students that I'm working with right now in the organizational change course, they're recognizing through the influencer model, looking at breaking down those behaviors and seeing how I can actually modify things. They're recognizing how many factors are involved and how many things they need to do. And through the 6 sources of influence model, they're recognizing that they have to use social motivation, personal motivation, structural motivation. They have to use all these different things. And at the same time, they have to experiment, adjust, try, experiment, try, adjust. Totally different than a test. But these students are recognizing by doing this in the real world, they're going to actually work. I had one student in a discussion saying, I don't want to sound arrogant, but I'm going to do this. If I implement all 6 sources, if I really am clear on my results, identify my vital behaviors, this change is going to work. I know it's going to work because I've covered all the variables. Now, she also said, and even if it doesn't work, I know how to make adjustments. When I read that, I was going, yes, she's got it, because she's living in the real world. She's applying this to the real world, right? That you don't get that from a test. Now, if we were to give her a test, she would do wonderful in the test because she's got the ability to adapt, overcome, to make adjustments, right? So yeah, it's a totally different perspective. You know, with authentic learning, you get the test for free or the test prep for free.
I was thinking about how much mental endurance it takes really to make that shift in a way. I was thinking also about, you know, your sons, but the doctors as well. You know, I don't want a doctor, let me just hear me out. I don't want a doctor who's really good at passing tests but has no experience with surgery working on me. That so well, you were talking about that. I thought he can pass all the tests he wants, but until he has that authentic learning opportunity to kind of practice on something or someone, or you know, I don't want him working on me. You know, and so you made a really strong point there to me. Just thinking about how important that real world context actually is, and to move away from the fixed mindset does require a little bit of mental endurance because when you say, well, if she were to authentic learning is your test, yeah, sure, absolutely. If you're stuck in a fixed mindset and you're not willing to adapt and change and modify, grow and move forward, and you just adjust a little bit, you're going to stay right in that fixed mindset, and that's going to be really difficult then to move ahead with your plans and what you hope to do and achieve in life. So it's a combination of shifting that focus and understanding the purpose and the passion and the why, but also looking ahead to where you want to be and who you want to become. And if we want that for ourselves, why wouldn't we want that for our learners in the classroom, whether we're higher ed or elementary? So that's
Oh,
my.
I think it's so important. You mentioned that I don't want a doctor who isn't practicing. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Over the years, I've moved around a lot, and because I move around a lot, and I'm getting old, I have to go for a yearly checkup. So I'm always checking out new doctors. And when I meet a doctor for the first time, if they walk into the office and they don't have a laptop or a tablet, and they don't go to the laptop or tablet for information, I'm not going to use that doctor. I don't trust them. I will not trust a doctor who's going to rely on their memory. I'm sorry. The medical profession is changing,
Yeah,
and over the last couple of years, I've learned, because of moving around, and as you get older, you have to sort of take care of yourself. You have to actually be wise, and I'm working with a couple of doctors right now, and these people regularly they come up beside me, and we're taking a look at the database. They're looking at different things, and they're talking about the stuff that they're looking at, and say, well, this research says this, and what do you think? And we have a discussion about what we're going to do, because, well, it's my health. I'm involved in the process, right? You know, it's different. So these people recognize you can't remember it all, right? So it's very, very important to do that. I think we recognize that the testing doesn't work, but how do we deal with this systemic issue? How do we convince teachers that if we prepare kids for real life, it also cover them for the test? How do we deal with that issue? That's a big one. What are
it
your
takes
thoughts?
time. It takes a little bit of time. They need some exposure to conversations like this to see that there is a little bit of a different side. I think the push is so heavily, it's so strong in schools. Our administrators are held accountable for scores. Our teachers are held accountable for scores. The states are held accountable for scores. Somebody needs to just bust right through that and say, let's hold our kids accountable for life. Let's hold our kids accountable for authentic learning experiences and what comes along with that. Instead, it's easier to teach knowledge, skills, and curriculum, and spend 80% of your time doing that, especially if you can recycle your old lesson plans. What's not easy is to break out of that a little bit and start thinking about who our kids want to become. That's what's important. They're going to look back one day and remember not what was on that test. They're going to remember what life experience they had. I mean, we go back to my Rube Goldberg experience. I just, it takes a little bit of courage to break out of that mindset. I understand because, I came from a classroom teacher myself, and one of the best experiences I had was teaching kids in kindergarten, when I allowed them to select their state and select their planet, and you know, they built their presentation and I helped them, I came alongside them. This was back in 2009, and they presented to the class and they presented to the news and everywhere else. You know, it was something they owned and they had a passion about. I didn't have to make them sit at the desk and write. You know, I think we need to get rid of desks and rows and really think about traditional ways that we can have flexible learning spaces where these kids can, you know, do what Dr. Bedard has in her iBuild Academy over in Florida, and check it out if you haven't heard of it. It's really pretty amazing what these kids are doing. They're building something that they're passionate about, and they're testing and trying, and along the way they're learning about robotics and Lego Mindstorm and math skills. And if I just cut it this way, you know, it might work that way. Kind of like what Levi and Caleb are doing when they're going down the mountain on their stage. You know, it's testing, trial, error. You know, those things are prepping them for life. Those science classes that allow kids to, you know, take apart a frog, and as gross as I think that is, kids learn things that way. They might know the anatomy of a frog and be able to relate that in some way to other animals, you know, and if maybe they want to be a veterinarian, maybe they don't. Maybe it'll contribute to their scientific knowledge in some way. Those are authentic to me, as long as they're not controlled too heavily. And I think we need to have a little bit of our kids don't need to get lost in our controlled learning environment. And that's what happens. Our kids are pushed through a learning environment that's controlled. And it, you know, to break away from that, a lot, you know, just testing out some things, using, you know, trying out different things with technology, using augmented reality in the classroom, virtual reality to change the way we learn a different concept. Why not test and try these things? These kids are going to get involved with creating and making this. And they'll learn so much more along the way than we've just focused on 4 + 4 = 8. You know, we've got to apply it to the bigger world concepts. And that goes back to authentic learning opportunities. And the kids have to have choice, ownership, and voice for that to happen. So we've got some work to do, Dr. H. We've got to talk to folks and get our DLL students, our communities of practice out there talking to folks, and you know, our delusional optimism to change the world one learner at a time. This is our step to do that. We're trying to, you know, think of these things, and hopefully it'll reach somebody who will listen.
So we have to help people alleviate the fear, or deal with not necessarily the fear is always going to be there, right? So help people deal with the fear of you know, meeting the requirements for testing. The other thing you mentioned was the notion of experimentation. We need to encourage that. We do that in the DLL program, and I think we're going to be doing that through our professional development courses that we're just about to offer. There's another thing that I think we need to do, and that is, and you already alluded to that. You mentioned, you know, Dr. Sue Bedard's work in iBuild Academy. That's an example of a real world learning environment, and she refers to it out of school learning, OSL. So it's a supplemental program. OSL is a new term. But if we look at some of our DLL graduates, a recent graduate up from New Jersey, and his experience with grade 3 mathematics, he moved away from just teaching a test, because first time the kids are going to be tested, they're statewide, grade 3. He went with authentic learning, had kids doing math and exploring math, and he tried to make it as real as possible. And their scores were significantly higher than the previous year, better than they could have imagined. And so I think the other thing that we need to do is point to a lot of these examples, that by doing real life, you can also prepare people for the test. I think it's going to be important for us to show that, because if you really think about where we've gone, so examples, and here's one more thing. I think we need to educate educators and administrators on how foolish this notion of preparing people for the test is. And I'm going to use an animal example, okay? I grew up on a farm, so these animal examples are easy, but I think people can understand this as well, okay? And I'll use an example that might be even politically appropriate in this current time. If you are preparing an animal for market, you want it to grow, you want it to be healthy. There's a lot of farmers out there, or there's a lot of companies out there who will force feedlot animals and feed them a diet that fattens them up really, really quickly. They get fat, they go to market. But the product that comes out of these animals isn't that great. It's not that healthy for us. It's not that wonderful. This idea of grass-fed animals, range-fed chickens, grass-fed, that's the best, it's the healthiest, organic. We know that that is the best, okay? Because it takes time, we care, we allow the animal to grow and develop effectively, as opposed to just force-feeding the animal, okay? So if we look at testing is like preparing the kid for the test, preparing the kid to be weighed. And we all know that if you weigh the kid enough times, it'll actually fatten them up. Well, no, it won't. Testing them multiple times doesn't help them. It just tells you where they're at. Unfortunately, we've got carried away with the testing. Because we have too much testing, teachers will fall into this, okay, let's force feed them. Let's prep them for the test. No problem. We can increase test scores. Easy to increase test scores. The science is clear on this. There's a lot of science on this, a lot of research. Give the students the right conditions, memory retrieval tricks. There's a whole bunch of methodologies for doing well when you need to regurgitate information. There's test prep skills that you can lessen people's anxiety. There's all kinds of things that you can do to increase test scores, and the research is clear. You can easily increase test scores, very easily. Now, when you take a look at actual learning, well, increased test scores doesn't always equate with increased learning, because if you look at the long term, the results, if you were to test students a month or two or after, those studies show that there's no retention. So if you want that deeper learning, you can't force feed the kids. You can't be stuffing them in the feedlots. You can't be pumping the information into them, hoping they'll regurgitate it effectively. You actually have to do that natural, long-term, extended learning environment where they actually grow. And as you were talking about, when we think about where do these kids want to be, who do they want to be, how can we help them to become who they want to be? Once these kids are engaged in growing and developing and growing into the potential that they have, you don't take that away from them. They'll do well on tests because they're growing into these people who are going to be future entrepreneurs, future business people, future lawyers, future doctors. They're growing into the people who are going to change the world, because we've invested that time, effort, and energy to help them grow into who they want to become. So if you look back at my animal example, yeah, sure. Hey, we've got a whole industry about force feeding animals. It's not so good. It works, not so good. We know it's not healthy. If you really want to be healthy, you got to do it right. And I think what we're looking at is doing it the right way. Now, doing it the right way, you also get the health, you also get the test, you get all the extra benefits. So the only challenge we face, what are some of the challenges with doing it the right way with authentic learning? Why is it so much easier to default to the test? Wonder why.
Takes time.
Time. Yeah.
Backwards design thinking, looking at learning outcomes first. Who do our learners want to become?
Yeah, the culture, the quick fix, right?
Got to deal with the silver bullets and folks thinking technology solves all the problems. It takes a lot of time to shift that.
Yeah, no, we've got that McDonald's drive-through mentality when it comes to education. Oh, something quick here. Let's just apply this. Here's a piece of technology. I'll apply this technology. We'll use Seesaw. Problem solved. And students are doing e-portfolios because we applied Seesaw. I'm not being critical of Seesaw. Wonderful tool. Wonderful. Excellent. But using it as a quick fix to have students use e-portfolios, well, why are you doing the e-portfolio?
Why? It goes back to why, right?
Yeah, well, it's helping students to find their own voice. Well, why do you want them to find their own voice? Well, because of research by Mesereau and Dewey and people like Bandura argue that until a learner actually expresses their voice through an oral format, through written, until they find their own voice and express their own voice, a lot of research shows they're not really learning. That reflection, that metacognition, that ability to find your voice. So using Seesaw is not about using the technology. No, using that tool is giving the learner the opportunity to do that metacognitive practice, to reflect on what it is they're learning, and to help them find their voice and to really take ownership. That's why we're doing it.
I think you've nailed what our next learner's mindset discussion needs to be, and that's really simply on using tech tools to support the learning process and what that looks like and how that can really enhance deeper learning based on the research. So
yeah, moving away from that quick fix. Yeah, I agree. So do you think we've exhausted this idea of preparing them for the tests as opposed to preparing them for life? Which is better? Well, I would argue preparing them for life. you think we've covered it all? Is there any other thing we need to talk about? I think
I think we covered it, but tests aren't bad. They're just, we want to clarify and qualify, right? They're a data point. They help you find
oh
out what learners are. So we're not saying that. We're just saying we've got to prepare our learners for life. There should be, if you think about it, just think about it common sense wise. What's more important, a test or life? That's an easy question to answer. If I'm preparing my learners for life, the test will come with it, come behind it at some point.
Well, actually, I think you've also introduced another topic for one of our discussions, and that is this idea that whenever we talk about these ideas, people automatically assume, oh, well, they're just talking about authentic learning, which means you can't do anything else. That's all you can do. Well, no, we're not extremists at this end. Well, not complete extremists. No, you got to find a balance. Yeah, you're right. We're not saying don't use a test. We're not saying you live in a world where we don't have tests. No, we live in a world where standardized testing is a reality. There's a way that you can mitigate it. And as we talked about in our other discussion on, which one was that? I can't remember now, but we had another discussion where we were talking about, it might have been rubrics or something where we talked about these ideas. But if you just focus on the testing, you're so limited. We're not saying just do that. We're saying do it all, but in the right context, in the right way, with the right amount of time, the right amount of focus, right? It isn't do it with one, just do the other. No, we're saying prepare them for life, and that will also prepare them for the test. But at the same time, have the kids prepare for the test. There's a lot of wonderful research out there that shows how you do that. So be wise, be honest about the fact that, yeah, we do have to prepare them for the test, but don't do it constantly. Don't focus on preparing them for the test, because all you're then doing is just sort of force feeding them the information. No, you want them to grow naturally, but at the same time, prepare them as they go along. So I think like everything, it's finding that balance. No real quick fix here. I think we have to find that tension, that balance.
Yep.
Tough
Okay.
to do. Well, I think that's about it for this session. So I want to thank you so much for entering into this conversation with me, and I'm looking forward to exploring our next conversation about technology and the quick fix and tech tools and stuff like that. I know you and I've been talking about that, and that one might be a bit of a long one. So next week, I think we're going to hit it. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.